The strongest empires don't collapse when enemies attack them. They collapse when the one person who built their heart quietly walks away. Ethan Park had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, stared down powerful rivals without raising his voice, and spent 15 years convincing the world that nothing could shake him. Yet on a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, standing inside the glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, he found himself frozen by something no amount of power could control. Naomi Carter Park stood only a few feet away, dressed in a simple dark blue sweater and jeans, her curls resting gently over her shoulders, her wedding ring catching the last golden rays of the setting sun. She looked exactly like the woman he had married 7 years earlier, yet somehow she also looked like someone he had never truly seen before. The silence between them stretched across the enormous living room, where polished marble floors reflected the fading light, and every expensive piece of furniture suddenly felt meaningless. Ethan had returned home nearly 3 hours later than promised. Again, his tailored charcoal suit still carried the faint scent of cedar and rain, while unopened messages continued vibrating inside the phone resting in his jacket pocket. He barely noticed them anymore. For years, his life had been measured by meetings, flights, negotiations, security briefings, and responsibilities that never seemed to end. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that providing everything his wife could ever need was the same as being present. Naomi slowly looked around the penthouse. The grand piano she never learned to play because he was always traveling. The dining table built for 12 guests where they almost always ate separately. The vacation brochures still tucked inside a drawer from a trip they had postponed 4 summers in a row. The framed wedding photograph sitting on the fireplace where 2 smiling people believed love alone could survive any storm. She took one slow breath before speaking, her voice calm enough to make every word hurt even more. "I gave you everything." Ethan finally looked up from the documents he had instinctively carried into the room. For the first time that evening, he noticed her eyes. They were not filled with anger. They were not searching for another argument. They were simply tired. Tired in a way that no amount of sleep could ever repair. "Naomi," he began quietly, but the sound of his own voice felt strangely unfamiliar. She gently raised one hand, asking him without words not to interrupt. "I gave up my apartment because you said we'd build a home together. I gave up my career because we agreed there would be another opportunity later. I gave up birthdays, anniversaries, weekends, vacations, and countless dinners because someone always needed you more than I did." Ethan opened his mouth again, ready to explain, ready to mention responsibilities, deadlines, expectations, obligations, everything that had become second nature. But every excuse suddenly sounded smaller than the silence filling the room. Naomi smiled, though it was not a smile born from happiness. It was the kind people wear when they have already cried every tear in private. Slowly, almost tenderly, she reached for the ring resting on her left hand. Ethan watched the movement without understanding it at first. That ring had survived 7 years of cross-country flights, sleepless nights, difficult conversations, joyful mornings, and promises whispered beneath candlelight. It had become as permanent as the skyline outside their windows. Until now, with remarkable gentleness, Naomi slipped the ring from her finger. The tiny circle of gold reflected one final beam of sunset before she carefully placed it on the polished walnut table between them. The faint metallic sound it made was barely audible, yet inside Ethan's heart it echoed louder than anything he had ever heard. He stared at the ring as though it belonged to strangers. "I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you," Naomi whispered. "I'm leaving because somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me." No shouting followed. No dramatic accusation. No slammed doors. Only silence. The kind of silence that settles over a room after truth has finally spoken. Outside, the lights of Manhattan slowly awakened one building at a time, while inside the penthouse, the most powerful Korean crime boss on the East Coast stood completely motionless, unable to take a single step toward the woman who had quietly carried his world for years. At that moment, Ethan still believed she would come back tomorrow. He still believed this was simply another difficult night that time would eventually erase. He had no idea that the small gold ring resting on the table was not the end of an argument. It was the beginning of the greatest loss his life had ever known. The ring remained exactly where Naomi had placed it long after the apartment door closed behind her. Ethan stood motionless, listening to the silence that replaced her footsteps, convinced that if he waited long enough, he would hear the familiar sound of her keys turning in the lock again. Instead, the only sound came from the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, where distant traffic drifted through the evening like a reminder that life continued whether hearts were ready or not. Almost without thinking, he reached for his phone and opened his calendar. Tomorrow was packed with meetings from 7 in the morning until nearly midnight. A dinner with investors, a conference call with partners in Seoul, a charity gala he had promised to attend weeks earlier. Every hour had been reserved. Every minute belonged to someone else. Then his eyes wandered to the wedding photograph resting on the fireplace, and for the first time in years, he actually looked at it. They had been standing beneath the old oak trees of Central Park on a warm September afternoon. Naomi's laughter had been so genuine that even the photographer lowered his camera for a second just to smile. Ethan remembered how impossible it had seemed that someone like her could ever choose someone like him. She had been volunteering at a neighborhood literacy program in Harlem every Saturday, helping children discover books that opened doors to worlds they had never imagined. She believed every person deserved patience, kindness, and a second chance. Ethan had first seen her while making an anonymous donation to the community center. She had no idea who he really was. To her, he was simply another quiet man in an ordinary gray jacket carrying boxes of books through the front door. She thanked him with a warm smile before asking if he could help arrange tiny chairs for the reading circle. No one had spoken to him that casually in years. No one had handed him a stack of picture books and asked whether he preferred organizing them by color or by author. He had almost laughed at the question because nobody in his world ever cared what he preferred. Week after week, he kept finding reasons to return. Sometimes he delivered supplies. Sometimes he donated anonymously. Sometimes he simply sat in the back of the room pretending to read while watching Naomi encourage shy children to believe in themselves. She remembered every child's birthday. She remembered favorite stories, favorite colors, even which students became nervous before reading aloud. Ethan had built a reputation by remembering contracts and numbers, yet Naomi remembered people. Months later, when he finally admitted that he wanted to take her to dinner, she laughed softly and said she had already wondered how long it would take him to ask. Their first date lasted nearly 6 hours. They walked along the Hudson River, shared oversized slices of New York-style pizza from a neighborhood restaurant, and talked about everything except money. Naomi spoke about becoming an education advocate someday. Ethan admitted he had never really experienced an ordinary family dinner growing up. She listened without judgment. She never pushed him to reveal more than he wished to share. She simply accepted the quiet spaces between his words. Even after discovering the truth about his extraordinary wealth and influence, she had looked into his eyes and said, "The only thing that matters to me is the man you become when nobody is watching." Ethan remembered promising that nothing would ever matter more than protecting the life they would build together. He remembered buying the penthouse because Naomi loved watching sunsets over the river. He remembered promising they would fill every empty room with laughter, music, family traditions, and ordinary evenings that belonged only to them. Somewhere between ambition and obligation, those promises had quietly been replaced by postponed vacations, missed anniversaries, hurried conversations, and apologies that sounded increasingly rehearsed. His gaze returned to the gold ring resting alone on the walnut table. Suddenly, he realized something that unsettled him far more than Naomi leaving. He could remember the exact day he purchased the ring, the exact jeweler who designed it, the exact speech he practiced before proposing. Yet he could not remember the last evening they had watched the sunset together without either one of them being interrupted. That single forgotten memory weighed heavier than every responsibility waiting inside tomorrow's calendar. Morning arrived without bringing relief. Pale sunlight spilled across the marble floors of the penthouse, revealing a home so perfectly arranged that it almost looked untouched by human life. Ethan had not slept. He remained seated in the same chair overlooking the Hudson River, still wearing yesterday's dress shirt, his untouched cup of coffee growing cold beside the gold ring that had not moved an inch. For years, mornings had followed the same rhythm. Naomi always woke before him, even after nights when he returned home well past midnight. She quietly brewed fresh coffee, opened the curtains just enough to let soft light fill the apartment, and left a handwritten note beside his breakfast whenever she knew he would leave before she could see him. Some notes reminded him to eat lunch. Others wished him good luck before an important meeting. Occasionally, she simply wrote that the sunset was especially beautiful and hoped they might watch the next one together. Ethan could not remember the last time he had actually answered one of those notes. His phone buzzed across the table. His chief of staff informed him that the driver was waiting downstairs and that investors had already arrived at headquarters. Ethan stared at the message before placing the phone face down. For the first time in over a decade, he ignored his schedule. Instead, his eyes wandered through the apartment, noticing details that had always existed but somehow escaped his attention. A knitted blanket rested neatly across the corner of the sofa. Naomi had made it herself during a winter when heavy snow kept them indoors for several weekends. She had joked that every uneven stitch would remind them that imperfect things often lasted the longest. On the bookshelf stood dozens of children's novels she continued collecting even after stepping away from the literacy program. She always said that one day they would have nieces, nephews, or neighborhood children visiting, and every child should leave carrying a book instead of a toy. Near the kitchen window sat a small ceramic planter holding herbs that she carefully watered every morning. Tiny handwritten labels marked basil, rosemary, thyme, and mint. Ethan suddenly realized he had never once asked why she smiled every time new leaves appeared. He had simply accepted that the plants somehow remained alive, just as he had accepted every quiet act of care that kept their home warm without ever asking who created that warmth. He slowly opened the refrigerator, expecting little more than groceries. Instead, neatly organized containers filled every shelf. Homemade soup prepared for evenings when he worked too late. Fresh fruit already washed and sliced. Meals labeled with dates so nothing would go to waste. There was even a dessert she had made 3 nights earlier because she remembered he once mentioned liking it years ago during a vacation in Boston. He had never tasted it. It remained untouched behind a carton of milk. Closing the refrigerator, Ethan leaned against the counter and allowed himself to remember all the invitations Naomi had extended over the years. A weekend road trip through Vermont during peak autumn colors. A Broadway show she had purchased tickets for months in advance. Sunday mornings at a local farmer's market. Volunteer events at the community center where they first met. Every invitation had received nearly the same answer. Maybe next week. After this project. Once things settled down, there would always be more time. Standing in the middle of the silent kitchen, Ethan understood the quiet cruelty hidden inside those words. Time had never settled down. It had simply moved forward while Naomi patiently waited beside it. His attention drifted toward a small corkboard hanging near the hallway. Tucked beneath a magnet shaped like a lighthouse was a handwritten bucket list in Naomi's unmistakable handwriting. Learn to sail. Visit Yellowstone National Park together. Dance in the kitchen without music. Watch 100 sunsets holding hands. Grow old in a home filled with laughter. Several items had little empty squares beside them waiting to be checked. None had been completed. Ethan gently touched the paper with his fingertips before lowering his hand. For years he had believed he was building an extraordinary life for the woman he loved. Only now did he begin to understand that while he had been busy creating an empire, Naomi had simply been waiting for an ordinary life with the man she married. And somewhere between those two dreams, she had quietly disappeared from the center of his world without ever raising her voice. By late afternoon, the apartment had become almost unrecognizable, not because anything had changed, but because Ethan was finally seeing what had always been there. Every room carried Naomi's quiet fingerprints. Every corner held evidence of a life built through patience rather than grand gestures. He walked slowly toward the small home office she rarely used anymore. The shelves were lined with binders, journals, and neatly labeled storage boxes. Nothing appeared dramatic. Nothing begged to be noticed. Yet somehow the simplicity unsettled him more than anything else had that day. He opened the first drawer and found dozens of handwritten thank you cards from families at the literacy center where Naomi had volunteered years earlier. Parents described how their children had learned to love reading because she never gave up on them. One little girl had written that Miss Naomi made her believe she could become an author someday. Ethan smiled faintly before realizing he had never asked Naomi what happened to those children. He had always assumed there would be another conversation, another weekend, Another quiet evening when they could catch up on everything they had missed. He continued opening drawers until he found a slim blue folder tucked beneath several notebooks. Inside were letters offering Naomi leadership positions at nonprofit organizations across New York and Washington, each one praising her compassion, intelligence, and ability to inspire communities. Every letter had been politely declined. Attached to one acceptance form was a short handwritten note in Naomi's careful script. "I choose us." Ethan closed his eyes for several seconds. He remembered those years clearly. His own career had been expanding faster than either of them imagined. There were constant flights, endless negotiations, and responsibilities that seemed impossible to refuse. Naomi never complained when opportunities required them to relocate or postpone their plans. Whenever someone praised Ethan's accomplishments at charity dinners or business events, she stood beside him with genuine pride, never mentioning the dreams she had quietly placed on hold. She celebrated every milestone he reached as though it belonged to both of them. Meanwhile, her own ambitions slowly disappeared into neatly organized folders hidden inside a desk that no one ever opened. Walking back into the living room, Ethan noticed a framed photograph on a side table. It showed Naomi standing beside an elderly neighbor in the apartment building. He vaguely remembered the woman, but could not recall her name. Then another memory surfaced. Naomi had spent nearly every Wednesday evening bringing groceries upstairs because the neighbor struggled to carry them. She never mentioned it unless someone asked where she had been. Across the room sat another photograph of Naomi laughing with the building's doorman during the first snowfall of winter. Ethan realized she knew every employee in the building by name. She baked cookies during the holidays for the maintenance staff. She remembered birthdays. She remembered anniversaries. She remembered who had children starting college and who was caring for aging parents. While Ethan managed companies filled with thousands of employees, Naomi quietly built a community one conversation at a time. His thoughts drifted toward countless evenings when he returned home exhausted to find dinner waiting, fresh flowers arranged on the dining table, soft music playing through the apartment, and Naomi greeting him with the same gentle smile despite having spent the day supporting everyone around her. He had accepted those moments as though they appeared naturally, never asking how much time, intention, or love they required. The apartment had never been maintained by convenience. It had been sustained by devotion. As sunset painted warm shades of amber across the skyline once again, Ethan stopped before the large window where Naomi always stood at the end of each day. Suddenly he understood why she loved that view so much. It was never about the city. It was about sharing it with someone she believed would eventually slow down long enough to notice the beauty beside him. The skyline remained exactly as magnificent as ever, but without Naomi standing there, every glittering light beyond the glass only reflected the emptiness growing inside the home they had once promised to fill together. The second morning, without Naomi, felt even quieter than the first. Ethan had canceled every meeting on his calendar, something his staff insisted had never happened before. Concerned messages continued filling his phone, but he ignored each one. None of them mattered as much as the unanswered question echoing through the apartment. Where had she gone, and why had he never realized she had been preparing herself to leave long before she walked out the door? He wandered into the bedroom and noticed that only half of the closet was empty. Naomi had not taken everything. Several sweaters still hung neatly on wooden hangers. A favorite mug remained on her nightstand. A novel she had been reading rested face down beside the bed with a bookmark tucked halfway through the story. It looked less like someone had abandoned a home and more like someone had quietly accepted that waiting any longer would only create deeper disappointment. As Ethan carefully opened the drawer of her bedside table, he found a small leather journal. He hesitated before touching it. Naomi had always respected his privacy without question. Reading her personal thoughts felt like crossing a line she never would have crossed herself. But resting on top of the journal was a folded note with his name written in her familiar handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the page. The message was surprisingly short. If you are reading this, it means you finally slowed down long enough to notice what has been sitting beside you all these years. The journal is not here to make you feel guilty. It is here so you can finally understand the moments we never had time to talk about. Ethan slowly opened the first page. The earliest entries were joyful. Naomi described their walks through Central Park, their first tiny apartment before the penthouse, and the excitement of planning a future together. She wrote about how safe she felt whenever Ethan smiled without thinking, because those rare smiles reminded her that beneath every responsibility lived the same kind man who once carried boxes of children's books into a community center. As the years passed, the entries gradually changed, not into anger, but into quiet hope. One page described waiting by the window with homemade pasta growing cold because Ethan's flight had been delayed again. Another recalled celebrating their anniversary alone with a slice of cheesecake after he called to apologize from another city. She never accused him. Instead, she ended each entry with nearly the same sentence. Maybe next time we will have our evening together. Ethan turned another page. Naomi had taped a ticket stub from a Broadway show they never attended because of an unexpected business dinner. Beneath it she had written, "I kept both tickets anyway. Hope is difficult to throw away." Another page held photographs from a weekend cabin she had reserved in the Catskills. The reservation had been canceled twice before quietly expiring. She wrote that the mountains would still be there whenever life became less busy. Life never became less busy. Ethan continued reading until one particular entry stopped him completely. It had been written exactly 1 year earlier. "Today I realized I have stopped asking him to come home early. Not because I stopped wanting him here, but because I became afraid of hearing another apology. I do not think distance begins when people live far apart. I think it begins the first time someone believes their disappointment will not surprise the other person anymore." Ethan lowered the journal into his lap and stared through the bedroom window. Every postponed dinner, every delayed vacation, every missed conversation suddenly formed a pattern he had refused to see. None of those moments had ended their marriage by themselves. Together they had quietly built an invisible wall, one ordinary day at a time. His eyes drifted back to the final completed page. Naomi had written only one sentence before closing the journal forever. Love should never have to compete with a calendar. Ethan closed the cover with extraordinary care, holding it against his chest as though it contained something impossibly fragile. In that moment, he understood that Naomi had not left because of one forgotten evening or one broken promise. She had left because she had spent years believing tomorrow would finally become the day they started living the life they had promised each other, and tomorrow had never come. The third day began with rain gently tracing silver lines across the towering windows of the penthouse. The city beyond looked softer beneath the clouds, as though even Manhattan had decided to lower its voice. Ethan stood in the kitchen holding Naomi's journal, reading the final sentence again before carefully placing it back inside the drawer exactly where she had left it. He understood now that searching for her was no longer about convincing her to come home. Before he could ask for another chance, he first had to understand the woman whose quiet strength he had mistaken for endless patience. He picked up his car keys and left the apartment without security or assistance following behind him. Hours later, he parked outside the familiar brick building that housed the literacy center where they had first met. The neighborhood had changed over the years, but the painted mural on the front wall remained untouched, filled with bright colors and smiling children holding books above their heads. As Ethan stepped inside, the scent of old paper, crayons, and fresh coffee instantly carried him back to another season of his life. A volunteer arranging children's books looked up and immediately recognized him. Her surprised smile slowly faded into gentle understanding. "You are looking for Naomi, are you not?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded without trying to hide the sadness in his eyes. The woman introduced herself as Linda, someone Naomi had worked beside for nearly a decade. She invited Ethan to sit in the same reading circle where dozens of children were laughing over picture books only a few feet away. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Linda broke the silence. "She always believed you would come back here someday." Ethan lowered his eyes. "She talked about me?" Linda smiled. "Almost every week." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Even after everything?" Linda gave a quiet laugh. "Especially after everything." She explained that Naomi never spoke with bitterness. Whenever volunteers asked why her husband could never attend community events, she always answered with kindness. She would say that Ethan carried responsibilities most people could not imagine, but she still believed the compassionate man she married was somewhere beneath the endless schedule. Linda reached beneath the table and handed Ethan a worn photo album. Inside were pictures spanning several years. Naomi reading to children. Naomi organizing book drives. Naomi comforting nervous students before reading competitions. Naomi celebrating high school graduations with families she had supported since elementary school. Ethan appeared in only 3 photographs. All 3 had been taken during the first year of their marriage. After that, Naomi attended every event alone. She never stopped wearing her wedding ring, Linda said quietly. The children always asked where her husband was. She would smile and tell them you were helping many people and that one day you would join them again. Ethan struggled to speak. I kept promising I would. Linda nodded gently. She believed you every single time. Before Ethan left, Linda walked him toward the entrance and paused beside a bulletin board covered with handwritten thank you notes from former students. One small card immediately caught his attention. In uneven handwriting, a young boy had written, Miss Naomi says the people who love us the most are usually the quietest because they spend more time showing love than talking about it. Ethan stood silently reading those words over and over again. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, rain had finally stopped and weak sunlight pushed through the clouds. His phone rang again. This time it was his chief of staff reminding him about an emergency executive meeting that absolutely required his presence. Ethan looked at the skyline in the distance before calmly declining the meeting. Then he asked a different question instead. Can you tell me where Naomi volunteered after leaving the literacy center? There was a long pause before the answer came. She spends Thursday afternoons at St. and Community Garden in Brooklyn. At least, she used to. Ethan ended the call and looked toward the bridge stretching across the East River. For the first time in many years, every business obligation, every contract, and every title seemed smaller than a single destination. Somewhere across the city, the woman who had quietly believed in him longer than he deserved was continuing her life without expecting him to arrive. And Ethan finally understood that if there was still a path leading back to her heart, it would begin not with another promise, but with showing up where she had always hoped he would be. Brooklyn welcomed the afternoon with the comforting scent of fresh soil, blooming flowers, and the distant laughter of children playing in a nearby park. Ethan parked his car across the street from St. and Community Garden and remained behind the steering wheel for several moments. He had spent years walking into boardrooms without hesitation, yet now he found himself uncertain about taking a single step through a simple wooden gate. He finally climbed out of the car and entered quietly, careful not to disturb the peaceful rhythm unfolding before him. Volunteers moved slowly between rows of vegetables and flowers, watering plants, pulling weeds, and sharing easy conversations beneath the warm spring sun. It was the kind of place where nobody seemed to care about expensive watches or important titles. Here, time was measured by growing seasons instead of business quarters. Ethan scanned the garden until his eyes stopped on a familiar figure near the back fence. Naomi knelt beside a group of elementary school children, helping them plant small tomato seedlings into freshly turned earth. She wore faded blue jeans, gardening gloves, and a simple baseball cap that shaded her face. Dirt covered her hands, and sunlight danced across her smile as she patiently showed a little boy how to press the soil gently around each tiny plant. Ethan realized he had not seen that smile in years. Not because she had stopped smiling, but because he had stopped being present to witness it. He remained hidden beneath the shade of a large maple tree, watching quietly. One little girl proudly held up a crooked row of seedlings and asked if they would really grow. Naomi laughed softly before answering. Everything grows when someone chooses to care for it every single day. Not all at once, just one day at a time. The children nodded as though they had just learned an important secret. Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside his own heart. After the gardening lesson ended, several volunteers gathered beneath a covered picnic area to share homemade lemonade and sandwiches. Naomi stayed behind to organize small gardening tools. An elderly groundskeeper approached her carrying a watering can. Ethan overheard only fragments of their conversation. The man thanked Naomi for spending every Thursday helping maintain the garden, even though she never accepted payment. Naomi simply smiled and replied, "This place reminds me that beautiful things need consistency more than perfection." The old man looked toward Ethan without recognizing him and quietly said, "Whoever has your heart must be a fortunate man." Naomi paused for only a second before answering with remarkable grace, "I hope one day he becomes one." There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, Only quiet hope wrapped inside gentle honesty. Ethan lowered his eyes, unable to move. A few minutes later, another volunteer walked over carrying a cardboard box filled with children's books. "Naomi, we received another donation," she said cheerfully. "Would you like to organize the reading corner again?" Naomi's face immediately brightened. "Of course," she answered. "Stories always make people feel less alone." Ethan watched as she carefully arranged colorful books on a small shelf built specifically for neighborhood children. She placed each title at eye level for young readers, straightened every cover, and added handwritten bookmarks with encouraging messages tucked inside. She treated every small act with extraordinary care, exactly as she had treated their marriage for so many years. Finally, one of the volunteers noticed Ethan standing quietly beneath the tree and walked over to greet him. Before the woman could call Naomi's name, Ethan gently raised his hand. "Please," he whispered, "do not tell her I am here." The volunteer studied his expression before nodding with understanding. Ethan remained there for several more minutes, watching Naomi laugh with children, comfort a shy teenager struggling to plant flowers, and thank every volunteer before they headed home for the evening. She had rebuilt a meaningful life without demanding recognition from anyone. As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, Naomi gathered her gardening gloves, picked up a canvas tote bag, and walked through the garden gate without ever looking back. Ethan stayed where he was until she disappeared around the corner. He had finally found her, yet he understood that following her now would only interrupt the peace she had worked so hard to rediscover. For the first time since she left, he realized that loving someone was not about convincing them to return. It was about becoming the person they once believed you could be before asking them to trust you again. The next Thursday, Ethan returned to St. and Community Garden before sunrise. This time, he did not remain hidden behind a tree or inside his car. He arrived carrying a pair of simple gardening gloves, wearing faded jeans, and an Old Navy sweatshirt instead of one of his tailored suits. The volunteers greeted him with polite curiosity but asked no questions. They simply handed him a rake and pointed toward a section of flower beds that needed attention before the children arrived. For nearly 2 hours, he worked quietly beneath the cool morning sky, clearing fallen leaves, spreading fresh mulch, and watering rows of young plants. His hands, once accustomed only to signing contracts and shaking hands at formal events, slowly became stained with soil. Strangely, he found the work calming. Every completed task produced something visible. Every flower bed looked healthier because someone had taken the time to care for it. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Ethan heard familiar laughter behind him. He turned slowly. Naomi had just entered through the wooden gate carrying the same canvas tote bag he had seen the week before. She stopped walking the instant she recognized him. Neither of them spoke. The gentle sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the silence between them. Ethan removed his gloves and walked toward her, stopping several feet away. He made no attempt to move closer. He understood that some distances could not be crossed without permission. Naomi looked at him carefully, noticing the dirt on his hands, the tiredness beneath his eyes, and the absence of the expensive watch he rarely removed. "You found me," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Not to ask you to come home." She looked surprised but remained silent. "I came because I finally realized I never truly understood the places that mattered to you. I spent years asking you to step into my world while never taking the time to step into yours." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "You always knew where to find me. I never hid." Her words landed gently, yet they carried more weight than any accusation. Ethan swallowed slowly. "I know." Another quiet pause settled between them. Nearby, volunteers continued preparing the garden, respectfully pretending not to notice the conversation. Children would begin arriving within the hour. Life continued moving forward around them. Ethan reached into the pocket of his sweatshirt and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," he said. "Not because I expect forgiveness. I only wanted to say the things I should have said years ago." Naomi accepted the letter but did not open it. Instead, she held it gently in both hands. Ethan continued speaking before fear could silence him. "I spent days reading your journal. I visited the literacy center. I met people whose lives you changed. I learned more about you in 1 week than I allowed myself to learn during the last 7 years. That is the hardest truth I have ever faced." Naomi's eyes softened, though sadness still rested behind them. Understanding me now does not erase feeling invisible then. Ethan nodded immediately. I know it does not. He took one slow breath before continuing. I used to believe love meant protecting someone by giving them everything money could buy. You spent years trying to teach me that love is measured in shared breakfasts, finished conversations, ordinary evenings, and showing up when nothing important seems to be happening. I was always chasing tomorrow while you were asking me to notice today. Naomi looked toward the rows of flowers stretching across the garden. Do you know why I love gardening? She asked softly. Ethan shook his head. Because nothing healthy grows from one grand gesture. It grows because someone keeps coming back every day, even when nothing seems to change. Ethan felt those words settle deeply inside him. Then I am willing to come back every day, he answered. Not because I deserve another chance. Because becoming that person is long overdue. Naomi remained quiet for several seconds before carefully folding the unopened letter and placing it inside her canvas bag. I cannot promise what happens next, she admitted honestly. Neither can I, Ethan replied. For the first time in my life, I am not asking for a promise. I am asking for the opportunity to earn trust one ordinary day at a time. Just then a group of excited children ran through the garden gate, calling Naomi's name with joyful enthusiasm. She smiled instinctively and turned toward them. Before joining the children, she looked back at Ethan one last time. There was still uncertainty in her eyes, but for the first time since she walked out of the penthouse, there was no longer only goodbye. There was also the quiet possibility that some seasons, with enough patience and faithful care, could begin to bloom again. Autumn arrived quietly, painting Central Park with shades of amber, crimson, and gold that drifted gently across winding paths where strangers paused to admire the changing season. Nearly 4 months had passed since Ethan first stepped into Saint and Community Garden wearing borrowed gloves instead of a tailored suit. Since that morning, he had returned every Thursday without exception. Sometimes he helped children build raised garden beds. Sometimes he repaired wooden benches or carried boxes of donated books into the reading corner. Other days, he simply listened while Naomi spoke with families, volunteers, and neighbors whose names he gradually learned to remember. He never asked when she would come home. He never asked whether she had forgiven him. Instead, he allowed his actions to speak one ordinary day at a time. The changes reached far beyond the garden. He no longer scheduled meetings during evenings. Every Sunday remained untouched on his calendar, reserved for family, friendships, and moments that could never be postponed again. He quietly funded new literacy programs without attaching his name to a single donation. He called employees simply to ask about their families instead of quarterly reports. Even those who had worked beside him for years noticed that the man who once measured success by achievements had begun measuring it by presence. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Naomi invited Ethan to walk through Central Park after volunteering at a neighborhood reading festival. It was the first invitation she had offered since leaving the penthouse. They walked slowly beneath towering maple trees, listening to children laugh as they chased fallen leaves across the grass. Neither of them hurried the conversation. They spoke about books, gardening, favorite restaurants they had not visited in years, and the elderly neighbor who had recently celebrated her 92nd birthday. They laughed more than either of them expected. The silence between their words no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. As the sun began lowering behind the skyline, they arrived at the same quiet place where they had exchanged wedding vows 7 years earlier. The old oak trees stood exactly as they had then, their branches stretching gracefully across the fading sky. Ethan stopped walking and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Naomi noticed the familiar small velvet box, but gently shook her head before he could open it. "You do not have to," she whispered. Ethan smiled softly. "I know." Instead of kneeling immediately or making a dramatic speech, he carefully removed the small gold ring she had left behind months earlier. He held it in the palm of his hand for a long moment before looking into her eyes. "This ring used to represent promises I believed were enough simply because I made them," he said quietly. "Now it reminds me that promises only matter when they are lived every day." Naomi looked at the ring before meeting his eyes again. She saw no desperation, no performance, and no expectation. Only humility. Ethan slowly lowered himself onto one knee, not as a powerful man seeking admiration, but as a husband who had finally learned the value of ordinary moments. I cannot change the years I failed to see you, he said. I cannot erase the evenings you spent waiting or the dreams you placed aside for mine. But if you are willing, I would like to spend the rest of my life making certain you never have to wonder whether you matter again. Tears gathered gently in Naomi's eyes. She remained silent for several seconds before extending her left hand toward him. Ethan did not rush. He carefully placed the ring back onto her finger with the same tenderness she had shown when removing it months before. This time there were no photographers, no guests, and no applause. Only two people standing beneath familiar trees while autumn leaves drifted quietly around them. Naomi reached for his hand, and together they continued walking along the path as the last light of day settled across the park. The city beyond remained as busy as ever, but neither of them looked toward the skyline. They had finally learned that the richest life was never built inside towering buildings or crowded calendars. It was built inside ordinary mornings, shared sunsets, honest conversations, and the daily decision to choose one another again. And on that peaceful autumn evening, the world did not witness the return of a powerful man or the triumph of an extraordinary empire. It witnessed something far greater. It witnessed what dignity, humility, and faithful love look like when they finally grow together, one ordinary day at a time.